saw a picture the other day of a paddle hanging up in a shop in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. This paddle was just about like you'd find in any principal's office or coach's office when I was growing up back in the 60s and the 70s. But on the side of that paddle was an inscription. It said, "Make kids great again." Now I realize that that's going to trigger a lot of people, but I thought it was really funny. And yet, when I got to thinking about it, it was kind of sad too. We've kind of abandoned that form of discipline, haven't we? We've advanced beyond that stage in our modern world. We've put away these barbaric practices of actually having some form of punitive discipline. And so, as a result of it, we just don't paddle anymore. We don't give swats anymore, especially at school. And I believe we're paying the price for that, don't you? There's a proverb in Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 1. It says, "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but whoever hates correction is stupid." Well, that's kind of a harsh phrase, isn't it? But remember, this is an inspired saying from God. He wants us to know that if we love discipline, it's because we love knowledge. Not all discipline, obviously, is corrective or punitive, at least in that correction. But there comes a point in discipline that you have to have some sort of a punishment to go along with it if the behavior is not achieved through the normal course of discipline. There's a lot of aspects to discipline. As an adult, you recognize them. Your alarm goes off at 6 o'clock in the morning because you need to be somewhere by 7. If you have discipline, you're going to get up when the alarm goes off. If you don't, you're just going to keep on hitting that snooze button. And at some point, you're just going to be rushing to whatever you are needing to do. Discipline protects you from rushing into things and making mistakes that maybe are pretty expensive mistakes at that. And again, I want to say part of discipline, when it comes to the point where it's just not taking, is punishment. And this is especially true for children, isn't it? When I was growing up, there was essentially a two-step method for discipline. It was give the instructions, and then if they were not heeded, you got a swat. Now that may seem cruel, again, to those in our enlightened age, but it was not considered cruel at that time at all. As a matter of fact, it was considered a standard. Then there was a guy called Dr. Benjamin Spock who wrote a bestseller, and in that bestseller he questioned the way that people were punishing their children when it came to discipline. And he really encouraged the idea of more reasoning with your children, and certainly never any kind of spankings or swats. And so a generation grew up that was very heavily influenced by that. It's true there were a number who were still getting discipline and punishment to go along with it, but fewer and fewer until we come to the point where we are today. Have you thought about the difference between school just 30, 40 years ago or more and today? 40 years ago, you didn't have metal detectors when you came into the school. Now, they were fairly new and they were very expensive at that time, but you didn't have a need for metal detectors. It's not that no form of violence ever occurred at schools. There's always going to be some violence whenever you have people get together, but it's very rare to have that. 40 years ago, you didn't need a cop on campus or a whole set of policemen on campus. Discipline was pretty much taken care of in-house. The teachers would give the instructions that they expected to be carried out, and if they weren't, you got sent to the office. There you were either reprimanded or you were given a spanking, and then you were sent back. And if that didn't take, you repeated the process until it did take. It was a fairly simple process. Not so today. When I was going back to get my teacher's degree somewhere in the early 2000s, there was something like a 7-step method for discipline. It involved with everything from the initial set of instructions to a warning if the instructions were not met right, to this gentle steering in the right direction, to psychological approaches to the matter, and just on and on and on. takes forever. And while the teacher is involved with that 7-step discipline process, they lose teaching time. And if they have a number of children that are involved in that 7-step process or whatever it is, they lose a lot of teaching time. And before you know it, most of school is just trying to keep the kids under control because you've lost control. The control you had when things were simpler, when you were trying to make kids great, and when they were getting out of hand, you just gave them a swat as a reminder that there's a consequence for bad behavior. When you're a parent and you have brand new children, you know how it is. They start crawling around and they start reaching for that electrical cord. And you're concerned about that. What do? Well, the first thing you tell them is no, no. But what if they keep reaching with that drooly little hand? Well, at some point, you're going to have to swat that hand. Now, I realize we can also child-proof the home, and there's a certain amount of child-proofing that's very prudent, but you can't child-proof everything. You've got to instill discipline within the child at a very early age, even if they don't understand the reasoning behind it. A 1-year-old is not going to understand the reasoning. You cannot sit them down and explain to them how dangerous 120 volts of electricity would be if they have it running through their body because they reach for an electrical cord. And so you give them a firm tap on the hand. It's going to hurt their feelings more than it's going to hurt their body, but it's going to drive the point home. When we talk about those who hate instruction being stupid, that's true not only of the ones who are getting into trouble, but it's true of those who hate to give the instruction in the right way. And again, we're talking about stupid from God's perspective. We're not talking about just a disagreement of discipline methods. We're talking about God's way. In Proverbs chapter 13 and verse 24, there's a very controversial proverb. It says, "He who spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is careful to discipline him." That wasn't controversial for the first 3,000 years of its existence. It's only become controversial in the last 40 or 50 years when people have gone past that barbaric time when you actually swatted people for bad behavior, when you actually made pain a part of the discipline process. But I can assure you this, as somebody who grew up with spankings, it was much more loving for mom and dad to say no and then to have a consequence for that than it would have been for my parents just to have let me done whatever I wanted to do. Or even worse, just absolutely yelling and screaming harsh things at me because they didn't know what else to do. I knew my parents loved me. I didn't like a spanking, but I understood it from a very early age, and so too will your children. In Proverbs 13:13 it says, "Whoever scorns instruction will pay for it." This is true both for the parent and for the child, for the teacher and for the student. And the sooner we realize that there is a penalty involved with instruction not being done right, the better off we'll be and the better off everybody around us will be. Now, you take the child without discipline, that 10-month-old that didn't get the swat on the hand but had everything child-proofed within that house, and then they bubble wrapped that child whenever they'd go outside of the house so they wouldn't have any problems. They never were told no because that would just be too harsh for little Johnny or little Mary. We didn't want to upset him. Well, at some point, little Johnny and little Mary are going to be Big John and Big Mary. They're going to be 18 years old and they're going to be turned loose on society. What then? We see it all the time on our social media, don't we? Videos of young adults who never grew up, who were never swatted, who were never told no. And then they're shocked when the world tells them no. The fact is that if children are not given discipline, and if discipline is not instilled into their life while they're still children, at some point society's going to have to discipline them. And very often that discipline becomes very harsh. It can be imprisonment, or it can be worse. How many parents who thought they loved their child too much to spank them later on visited their child in prison or even worse, at the morgue, because they got into something that mommy and daddy just didn't have the heart to tell them no for. Discipline's a good thing. In Hebrews chapter 13, there is one of the best illustrations of what proper discipline will do for you. In Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 11, it says this: "No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful." Probably talking more along the punitive side of discipline at this point, aren't we? "No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it." If you really do love your children, you're going to train them with discipline. It's not always going to be easy. Think about the farmer who has beautiful crops each and every year. They go out and they work the ground. They plow it. They get the soil ready to prepare the seed. They put that seed in, and then they make sure it's got the proper nutrients with fertilizer and the proper watering. They'll come back and they'll till that soil. They'll get rid of all the harmful weeds out of it. It's a lot of work to do that. But once harvest time rolls around, they've usually got a pretty good harvest, and they usually get paid pretty well for that pretty good harvest. It's the same thing, but on a much more important scale when we talk about our children. It's not easy to teach a child to be disciplined, to get up with the alarm clock, to do their chores, to make sure they're in class and attentive, to make sure they're doing their homework. When they're old enough to get their first job, to make sure that they understand how important it is to get to their job on time and to do the work that they were hired to do. Discipline's a hard thing, just like farming's a hard thing, but at some point there's going to be a harvest. And isn't it pleasant for those of you who were raised well by your parents to get together with your parents and enjoy those times of peace and just happiness? There's a security in good discipline. You can look forward to that if you have children, if you'll just raise them well. I realize that the punitive form of discipline can go too far and become abusive. We are not talking about that. But just as the proper form of discipline, with punishment involved that's worse, where the consequences are greater than the anticipation of the gain by the bad behavior, just as that can be unpleasant at the time, it's going to train our children to do the right thing. It's going to give them the proper mindset. And as they grow older, we start introducing all this reason that we wished we could have when they were 10 months old, and we wished we could have explained to them why electricity was bad for them. And you start explaining to your children the importance of service to God, and you encourage them to read the Bible for themselves so they don't end up leaving the house with your faith, they end up leaving the house with a faith of their own. It's very critical, parents. That's not going to happen unless they have had proper discipline to have a desire to go to the Word and look and find out what God has for them. The ultimate goal for all of us is heaven, and therefore the ultimate goal of discipline, proper discipline, including proper punishment in its place, is heaven. We want to be with God forever. The way we're going to do that is if we're proper servants of God. And parents, you need to be raising and training proper servants of God so that those proper servants of God can raise and train the next generation of good servants. Discipline yields a wonderful harvest, and then there's heaven. Or you can raise a child without discipline. You can tell yourself that you just love them too much to ever hurt them. But beware that there are heavy consequences for that, because whoever hates instruction will indeed pay for it someday. And if we really, truly love our children, we're going to do our best to instill the proper amount of discipline, including the proper amount of punishment when the time calls for it, so that our children can grow up to be good citizens, good spouses, good employees, good friends, good servants of God. And then again, someday there will be heaven. This is why we need discipline. Well, that's it for today. I appreciate your tuning in. I hope this gives you something to think about. Let me know what you think. If you disagree, that's fine. I don't mind that as long as the conversation in the comments is civil. So feel free to disagree. I'm not right every time. But I can honestly say that because my parents did their best to raise me up in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and included the proper amount of discipline and punishment with that, that I've had a very happy life as a result of that. The proper discipline is going to make your life good. Something to think about, isn't it? Thanks for listening.